Trapped in the Mirror, a family's terrifying journey into a haunted reality. Chapter 1: The Inheritance. The Harcourts arrived at the mansion under a sky heavy with clouds, the air thick with the scent of rain that had yet to fall. The winding road had led them deeper into the countryside, away from the town and its familiar comforts, until finally, the towering silhouette of the Victorian house loomed before them. Stood atop a hill, pointed gables piercing the sky, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets among themselves. James Harcourt, a man of practical mind and reserved demeanor, parked the car and looked up at the house that was now theirs. His wife, Clara, sat beside him, her hands gripping the edge of her seat, her eyes wide with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. In the back seat, Emily, their 16-year-old daughter, stared at the mansion with undisguised interest. The place had an air of mystery that she found both intriguing and unsettling. "Well," James said, breaking the silence that had settled over them during the drive. "Here we are." Clara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "It's bigger than I imagined." "It's old," Emily added, leaning forward between the seats. "Creepy too." James gave a short nod. "Aunt Eleanor had a taste for the dramatic, I suppose. But it's ours now." The inheritance had come as a surprise. James hadn't been close to his aunt, a reclusive woman who had lived alone in this house for as long as he could remember. They had rarely visited, and even then, only briefly. Yet here they were, unexpected recipients of her estate. A mansion that seemed more a relic of another time than a home. They climbed out of the car, their footsteps crunching on the gravel drive as they approached the front door. The mansion seemed to watch them with its dark windows, paint peeling in places, the wood creaking under their weight as they stepped onto the porch. James produced the old key that had been sent to him along with the deed, its cold metal smooth in his hand. He slid it into the lock, and with a heavy click, the door swung open, revealing the dim interior. They entered cautiously, the scent of dust and age meeting them as they crossed the threshold. The air was cool, the silence oppressive. The foyer stretched before them, its high ceiling adorned with a chandelier that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. A grand staircase rose to the second floor, its banister carved with intricate designs that seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light. Clara shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. "It's so quiet." "It's been empty for a long time," James replied, though he felt the weight of the silence too. "We'll have to get used to it." They began to explore the house, their footsteps echoing through the halls. The rooms were furnished, though everything was draped in sheets, as if the house itself had gone to sleep long ago. Furniture was old but elegant, the wood dark and polished, fabrics rich and faded. Everywhere they turned, there were signs of the past. Photographs in ornate frames, heavy drapes that blocked out the light, faint smell of mothballs lingering in the corners. It was in the hallway, just off the main foyer. They found it. The mirror stood tall and imposing, surface reflecting the dim light in a way that made the shadows seem to shift and flicker. The frame was a work of art, though one that left an uneasy feeling in those who looked upon it. Carvings were detailed, almost lifelike, depicting twisted forms that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of one's eye. Grotesque faces, half hidden among vines and flowers, stared out with expressions of anguish and despair. Clara hesitated before it, her brow furrowed. What a strange thing to have in a hallway. James stepped closer, his hand brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the glass. It must be valuable. Eleanor always had a penchant for collecting unusual items. Emily stood back, her gaze fixed on the mirror. Something about it unnerved her, though she couldn't say what. It was just a mirror after all, but as she looked at her reflection, she thought she saw something move behind just a flicker, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. She blinked, and it was gone. "Let's leave it where it is," James suggested, sensing Clara's unease. "It's too heavy to move anyway." Clara nodded, though she seemed reluctant. "I suppose so." They continued their exploration, but Emily found herself glancing back at the mirror more than once. Each time she felt a strange pull, as though the mirror was watching her, waiting for her to return. That night, as they settled into their new rooms, the house creaked and groaned around them, the wind rustling the trees outside. Emily lay in bed, her thoughts drifting back to the mirror. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it, something beyond its eerie appearance. But it was late, and she was tired, and soon she drifted into a restless sleep. Down the hall, the mirror stood silent and still, its surface reflecting only the darkness of the night. Yet, if one looked closely, they might have seen a faint image flicker across the glass. Shadowy figure, distant and distorted, presence lingering just beyond the edge of perception. And so, the Harcourt spent their first night in the mansion, unaware that the mirror had already begun to weave its influence into their lives, its secrets waiting patiently to be discovered. Chapter 2. The Mirror's Secret. Clara Harcourt found sleep to be a fleeting companion in the days following their arrival at the mansion. Each night, as she drifted into slumber, her dreams were haunted by shadows that seemed to rise from the depths of the mirror, creeping silently through the darkened corridors of her mind. The figures were indistinct, mere silhouettes that shifted and flowed like smoke, their forms never fully realized. Yet, it was their presence, the sense of something waiting just beyond the veil of sleep, that filled Clara with a gnawing dread. The dreams began subtly at first, faint whispers that Clara couldn't quite grasp. The voices were low, murmuring in a language she didn't understand, their tone urgent, almost pleading. As the nights wore on, the dreams grew more vivid, more insistent. The shadows that emerged from the mirror no longer stayed within the confines of her mind. They seemed to spill over into her waking hours, leaving Clara with the unsettling feeling that she was never truly alone. During the day, Clara found herself inexplicably drawn to the mirror. She would stand before it, her gaze fixed on the polished surface, her thoughts muddled and fragmented. There was something about it, something she couldn't quite put into words, that tugged at her consciousness, a silent beckoning that made it impossible to look away. The grotesque figures carved into the frame seemed to writhe under her scrutiny, their expressions twisted in agony, perhaps warning. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was more than it appeared, that it was hiding something malevolent just beyond the glass. "Clara?" James's voice pulled her from her thoughts one afternoon. He stood at the entrance of the hallway, a concerned look on his face. "You've been standing there for a while. Are you all right?" Clara blinked, realizing how long she had been lost in the mirror's reflection. She turned to her husband, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, distracted." James wasn't easily convinced, but he let the matter drop. He had always been the more pragmatic of the two, his feet firmly planted in the realm of logic and reason. Yet even he couldn't ignore the sense of unease that seemed to hang over the house like a shroud. Determined to understand the source of their growing discomfort, James began to research the mansion's history. He spent hours in the dusty study, poring over old documents and letters that had been left behind. The house had a long and troubled past, stories of strange occurrences and inexplicable tragedies that had plagued its previous occupants. But it was the mirror that caught his attention most of all. According to the records, the mirror had been a gift to his Aunt Eleanor, token from a mysterious acquaintance who had visited her only once. The visitor, a man whose name was never recorded, had vanished without a trace shortly after the mirror's arrival. James dug deeper, discovering that the mirror's presence coincided with a series of disappearances and tragic deaths, each one more bizarre than the last. Families who had lived in the mansion before Eleanor had spoken of seeing things in the mirror, things that shouldn't be there, and always, without fail, those who became obsessed with the mirror met untimely end. James closed the book he had been reading, chill running down his spine. He wanted to dismiss it as mere coincidence, old superstitions that had no place in the modern world. But as he thought of Clara's strange behavior, the way she seemed drawn to the mirror against her will, couldn't help but wonder, there was more to the stories than he had initially believed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the mansion was swallowed by the shadows of night, Emily found herself alone in the hallway. She had been restless all day, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Now, standing before the mirror, she felt her heart begin to race, old knot of fear tightening in her chest. She glanced at her reflection, expecting to see only herself staring back. But instead, another figure stood beside her, a woman dressed in the elegant attire of a bygone era. The woman's face was pale, her eyes hollow with sorrow, her expression one of profound grief. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place as the figure's gaze met hers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The woman in the mirror didn't move, didn't speak, but her presence was undeniable. A ghostly apparition filled Emily with a terror she had never known. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman vanished, leaving Emily staring at her own reflection, her face pale and stricken. She fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence, her heart pounding in her ears. When she found her parents, she was breathless, her words tumbling out in a rush. She told them about the woman, about the sorrowful eyes that had looked into hers. But James, ever the skeptic, tried to soothe her fears with rational explanations. Stress, exhaustion, the strangeness of their new home. Clara, however, listened with a quiet intensity, her own experiences weighing heavily on her mind. She didn't dismiss Emily's fears as easily as James did. The mirror had cast its shadow over her as well, its secrets still hidden, but its presence felt in every corner of the mansion. As the family tried to settle down for the night, the house groaned in the darkness, the wind whispering through the trees outside. The mirror, now shrouded in shadow, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its surface rippling ever so slightly as though something lay just beneath, waiting to be discovered. Chapter 3. Alternate Reality. The Harcourt mansion, with its tall, brooding walls and thick curtains drawn against the light, had taken on a life of its own. Each day the air within seemed to grow heavier, as though the house itself was slowly suffocating the family. The mirror, once merely a disturbing oddity, had now become the sinister heartbeat place. It started with the reflections. They were small at first, barely noticeable differences that could be shrugged off as tricks of the light. Emily would catch a glimpse of herself in the mirror, her expression just a shade darker, her eyes slightly more hollow. She would pause, glance back, and see her reflection as it should be, perfectly normal. But the longer she looked, the more she realized that the mirror had its own way of showing the truth, an unsettling truth that didn't align with the world outside. One afternoon, Clara stood before the mirror, her reflection a perfect replica, but the hallway behind her was not the one she knew. The ornate wallpaper had been replaced by peeling, water-stained walls. The chandeliers above, which should have been gleaming with crystal brightness, were nothing more than rusted husks, their light flickering weakly. And there, in the dim light, she saw herself again. But this time, her doppelganger's lips were curled into a cruel, mocking smile, her eyes alight with malice. Clara recoiled, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. But something inside her wouldn't let her turn away. It was as if the mirror was calling to her, pulling her back with invisible threads. Each time she saw her distorted self, fear grew, but so did her curiosity. She became convinced that the mirror wasn't just showing them twisted versions of themselves. It was revealing a world where shadows ruled, where despair had taken root, where the house itself was a decaying tomb. The more Clara watched, the more the line between her reality and the one in the mirror began to blur. She would stand for hours, eyes locked on the glass, searching for meaning in the distorted images that stared back at her. The house around her began to feel less solid, less real. It was the mirror's world that seemed to have substance, as if it were not a mere reflection, but an alternate existence that could reach out and swallow them whole. James noticed the change in Clara first. Her usual warmth had turned cold, her once vibrant eyes now shadowed and distant. She no longer participated in the small daily routines that had once brought comfort. Meals together, the simple conversations that had always marked their days. Instead, she became increasingly obsessed with the mirror, convinced that it held some secret that could explain the suffocating dread that had taken hold of their lives. "Clara, you need to step away from that thing," James pleaded one evening, finding her once again standing motionless before the mirror. "This isn't healthy. It's just an old piece of glass. You're letting it control you." Clara's eyes never left the mirror. "You don't understand, James," she whispered, her voice trembling with conviction. "It's showing us something. something we're supposed to see. There's another world in there, a place where everything has gone wrong. I need to figure out what it's trying to tell us." James sighed, running a hand through his hair, which had begun to gray at the temples. He had always been the rational one, the one who could separate truth from fiction. But even he couldn't deny that something was deeply wrong with the house, with the mirror. Desperation drove him to search the house for answers, to delve deeper into the history that seemed to echo through every room. His search led him to a forgotten corner of the mansion, where he unearthed an old, dust-covered journal bound in cracked leather. Pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. It was Aunt Eleanor's journal, record of her last days in the mansion. As he read, a chill settled over him like a shroud. The entries began innocuously enough: notes on the daily running of the house, observations on the weather, and correspondence with distant relatives. But as the pages turned, tone shifted. Eleanor wrote of the mirror, how it had come into her possession under mysterious circumstances, how it had been given to her by a man whose name she could not recall, whose face she could not quite remember. She wrote of strange occurrences, of seeing things in the mirror that were not there, of hearing whispers in the dead of night. Then, the journal took a darker turn. Eleanor's handwriting grew erratic, her words filled with fear and confusion. She wrote of a curse, a mirror that served as a doorway to another realm, a world where the walls of the mansion were crumbling, where sorrow and madness reigned. She wrote of seeing her own reflection twist into something unrecognizable, feeling the pull of the mirror, drawing her into its depths. James's breath caught as he read the final entries, scrawled in a desperate hand. Eleanor had become convinced that the mirror was more than just a reflection. It was a portal, a gateway to a world that fed on despair and trapped the souls of those who gazed into it for too long. She spoke of a darkness that had seeped into the house, a malevolent force that sought to claim her, to drag her into its twisted reality. The last entry was unfinished, the ink smeared as though Eleanor had been interrupted mid-sentence. Final words were chilling. "It watches, it waits, and soon it will take us all." James closed the journal with trembling hands, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore the evidence, couldn't brush off Clara's fears or Emily's visions as mere fantasy. The mirror was more than a cursed object. It was a living thing, a malevolent presence that had ensnared them in its web. And now, it was only a matter of time before it claimed them, just as it had claimed Eleanor. He knew he had to act. But as he stood in the dim light of the study, the weight of the mirror's power pressed down on him. It wasn't just a matter of removing it from the house. The mirror had already taken hold, its influence spreading like a dark shadow through the mansion. And as James looked at his reflection in the study's window, he saw not his own face, a twisted version of himself, eyes hollow with despair, the world outside crumbling into ruin. The mirror had shown him the truth. The alternate reality wasn't just within the glass, it was coming for them, slowly pulling them into its grasp. And unless he found a way to stop it, they would all be lost, trapped in a world where there was no escape. Chapter 4. The Descent. The Harcourt mansion, once a refuge from the world, had become a place of nightmarish torment. The once welcoming halls now seemed to close in on the family, as though the walls themselves were conspiring against them. The mirror, with its sinister allure, had burrowed into their minds, warping their sense of reality until the line between the world they knew and the one reflected in the glass became dangerously blurred. Emily's nights were no longer her own. Sleep had turned into a battleground, where she was forced to face the sorrowful woman who had first appeared in the mirror. The woman's presence was now inescapable, her sad, hollow eyes fixed on Emily with a pleading that tore at her heart. Each night, the woman would reach out, her spectral hand trembling as though she was trying to grasp something just out of reach. She spoke in whispers, her words unintelligible at first, but gradually, Emily began to understand. "She will take you. The shadows will take you all." Emily would wake drenched in cold sweat, the woman's voice still echoing in her mind. Her days became a blur, the weight of the woman's warning pressing down on her until she could barely function. She withdrew into herself, her once vibrant spirit now shrouded in fear. But she couldn't bring herself to tell her parents. They were already on the brink, and she didn't want to push them over the edge. Clara, on the other hand, had surrendered to the mirror's pull entirely. The more she gazed into its depths, the more she became convinced that the mirror was not a curse, but a key, a way to undo whatever dark fate had befallen them. The alternate reality that the mirror showed was not just a reflection of their fears, but a place where those fears had come to life. And somehow, Clara was certain that the tragedy she saw looming in the mirror could be averted if only they could cross over and change the course of events. It was in Eleanor's journal. Clara found the answer she had been seeking. Hidden among the ramblings of a mind unraveling were pages detailing an ancient ritual, one that Eleanor believed could bridge the gap between the two realities. The ritual was dangerous, requiring both a sacrifice and the will to face whatever horrors lay on the other side. But Clara was beyond reason, her mind consumed by the need to protect her family from the impending doom she had glimpsed. James watched helplessly as Clara spiraled deeper into madness. He had tried to reason with her, to pull her back from the brink, but it was as though she no longer heard him. She would sit for hours, the journal open in her lap, her eyes distant as she muttered to herself about saving them, about rewriting their fate. James's own grip on reality was slipping, the mirror's dark influence clawing at his mind until he no longer trusted what he saw, what he felt. The house had become a prison, and he could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker with each passing day. The storm came suddenly, a violent torrent of wind and rain that battered the old mansion, causing the windows to rattle and the floors to creak ominously. The storm was a manifestation of the turmoil that had taken hold within the Harcourt family, physical representation of the darkness that had consumed them. As the storm raged outside, Clara made her decision. She could no longer wait. The mirror was calling to her, urging her to act before it was too late. "Emily, we have to do this," Clara whispered urgently, shaking her daughter awake. Emily blinked groggily, her sleep-deprived mind struggling to understand her mother's frantic words. "Ritual? It's the only way. We have to cross over to fix whatever's wrong in that world before it's too late." Emily wanted to refuse, to pull away and tell her mother that she was wrong, that the mirror was evil, that they needed to destroy it, not embrace it. But something in Clara's eyes, a desperation, fierce determination, made Emily hesitate. She had always trusted her mother, had always believed that Clara would never lead her astray. And so, against her better judgment, she agreed. The ritual was a macabre affair. Clara had gathered the necessary items: a knife, a mirror shard, and a vial of her own blood, following the instructions laid out in Eleanor's journal with meticulous care. The storm outside intensified as they began, the wind howling like a chorus of anguished spirits, the rain lashing against the windows in a relentless onslaught. The mansion seemed to groan in protest, the old wood creaking as if the house itself was trying to stop them. They stood before the mirror, the ornate frame seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. The surface of the glass had taken on an otherworldly sheen, rippling like the surface of a pond disturbed by an unseen force. Clara handed Emily the knife, her hands trembling as she instructed her daughter to make a small cut on her palm, to let a few drops of blood fall onto the mirror. Emily hesitated, fear gripping her heart as she stared at the blade. But Clara's voice, firm and unwavering, broke through her terror. "We have to do this, Emily. We have to save ourselves, save your father. This is the only way." With a deep breath, Emily made the cut, watching in horror as the blood dripped onto the mirror's surface. The glass shuddered, the ripples intensifying until it looked as though the mirror was made of liquid silver. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second, vibrating through their bones until it became a deafening roar. As they recited the incantation from the journal, the mirror's surface began to glow, a sickly green light emanating from its depths. The reflection within started to shift, the hallway behind them fading away to be replaced by a scene of utter desolation. The walls were crumbling, floorboards rotting, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. And there, in the midst of the destruction, stood their twisted reflection, watching them with eyes full of malice. Just as they were about to step through, the door to the hallway burst open, and James rushed in, face a mask of horror. "No, Clara, Emily, stop!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony that filled the room. But it was too late. The mirror's pull was too strong, force of the ritual too powerful. As James reached out to grab them, to pull them back from the brink, the mirror's surface erupted in a blinding flash of light, and all three of them were yanked forward into the darkness beyond the glass. The storm outside raged on, the mansion's walls groaning under the strain, but inside the Harcourt family was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving only the mirror behind, its surface once again still and silent. Chapter 5. The Mirror World. The Harcourt family emerged from the mirror's grasp into a world that felt familiar yet horrifically altered. Their once grand mansion now stood before them in a state of terrifying decay. The walls, once resplendent with Victorian elegance, were now crumbling, covered in mold and creeping vines that pulsed as if alive. Floorboards creaked underfoot, rotting and unstable, threatening to give way at any moment. Air was thick, oppressive, heavy with the stench of death and the bitter tang of fear. A strange darkness permeated every corner, a darkness that seemed to have substance, as though it could reach out and pull them into its depths. Shadowy figures flitted in and out of sight, lingering just beyond their vision, watching with unseen eyes. They felt the weight of those eyes, a relentless gaze that bore into their souls, stripping away the last vestiges of their courage. The house itself seemed alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy, thrummed in the air, echoing in their bones. The atmosphere was stifling, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe, as if the very air was thickened with the despair and fear of those who had been trapped here before. It wasn't long before they encountered the woman who had haunted Emily's dreams, the sorrowful figure whose presence had loomed over them since their arrival in the mansion. But now she was not just a fleeting image in the mirror. She was real, standing before them, her face etched with grief and torment, her eyes hollow and haunted, fixed on them with a desperation that chilled them to the core. "I am Eleanor," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. "I was once your aunt, your blood, but I have been trapped here for so long, I hardly remember who I was. This place, it feeds on us, on our fears, our regrets. It twists them, amplifies them, until we are nothing more than shadows, echoes of who we once were." James, Clara, and Emily listened in stunned silence as Eleanor explained the horrific truth of their situation. The mirror was no mere object. It was a gateway, a conduit to this dark reflection of their world. But this place was not a simple mirror image. It was a place where the darkest aspects of their souls were magnified, where the emotions they had kept buried were laid bare and used against them. The mansion in this world was a living entity, a parasite that thrived on their suffering, growing stronger, each new victim it ensnared. "The only way to escape," Eleanor continued, voice trembling with urgency, "is to confront the darkness within you. You must face the fears and guilt that bind you here, keep you tethered to this cursed place. Only then will you find the true reflection of your souls, the one that can free you from this nightmare." Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she absorbed Eleanor's words. She had always prided herself on being in control, on managing every detail of their lives. But now she saw how that need for control had become an obsession. It had driven her to this point, to the brink of madness, where she had risked everything she loved for the illusion of power over fate. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was unavoidable. Emily's fear was more visceral, a terror of being trapped, of losing herself in a place where she had no agency, no ability to escape. She had always feared helplessness, and now she was living her worst nightmare. The shadowy figures that watched them from the corners of the room were like the embodiment of that fear, silent, malevolent witnesses to her struggle. James, meanwhile, was forced to confront his own failings. He had always buried himself in work, telling himself that it was for the good of his family, that his absence was justified by the life he was providing for them. But now, in this twisted reality, he'd see the truth. How his neglect had sown the seeds of their current nightmare, how his distance had left his wife and daughter vulnerable to the darkness that had crept into their lives. The guilt was overwhelming, pressing down on him like the weight of the world. As each of them grappled with their personal demons, the mansion seemed to react, the shadows growing darker, the walls pressing in closer. The twisted reflection of their home was alive with their pain, feeding on their despair. But Eleanor's words echoed in their minds. Only by facing the truth, by accepting the parts of themselves they had tried so hard to hide, they hoped to escape. Clara, her eyes filled with tears, turned to her family. "We can't let this place destroy us. We have to face it together. We have to confront whatever it is that's holding us here." Emily, trembling with fear but determined not to give in to the darkness, nodded. "I don't want to be trapped here, Mom. We have to find a way out." James, feeling the full weight of his guilt, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I've made mistakes, but I won't let those mistakes define us. We will face this together as a family." And so, with a resolve born of desperation, the Harcourts prepared to confront the twisted reality that held them captive. The mansion seemed to pulse with anticipation, as though it knew the battle that was about to unfold. The shadows thickened, the air grew colder, and the oppressive atmosphere closed in around them. But the Harcourts, united in their determination, stepped forward into the darkness, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them in the mirror world. Chapter 6: The Escape. The Harcourt family moved through the decayed mansion with a sense of urgency, driven by the weight of their discoveries and the realization that time was running out. Every step they took felt heavy, as if the air itself was thickening around them, trying to slow their progress. The house, a twisted mockery of their once grand home, seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own, the walls closing in on them, the shadows growing ever darker. They followed Eleanor's guidance, her spectral form leading them through the labyrinth of rooms and corridors. She seemed more at peace now, her sorrowful expression softened by the knowledge that her long imprisonment was nearing its end. Yet a sense of urgency drove her forward, pushing them to move faster, find the hidden room that held the key to their salvation. At last, they reached a door unlike any other in the mansion. It was simple, unadorned, standing in stark contrast to the grotesque surroundings. Eleanor hesitated before it, her translucent hand hovering over the handle as if afraid of what lay beyond. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. "Beyond this door, you will find the truth, the reflection of what you could be, what you should be." James stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "We're ready," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "We'll face this together." Clara and Emily nodded in agreement, their resolve firm despite the fear gnawing at their insides. Together, they pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the decaying mansion. It was bright, warm, filled with light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. In the center of the room stood a large mirror, its surface smooth and clear, reflecting not the twisted reality they had been trapped in, but an image of their family as it should be. Whole, united, and strong, they saw themselves as they longed to be. James, attentive and present, his arm around Clara's shoulders. Clara, calm and at peace, her eyes free of the frantic obsession that had consumed her. And Emily, standing tall, confident, and unafraid. It was a vision of the life they could have had, the life they still could have, if they found the strength to accept their flaws and work together. "This is who we are meant to be," Clara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Not the people we've become, people we can still be." James reached out, taking her hand in his. "We've let our fears and regrets tear us apart, but it's not too late. We can change. We can break free of this curse." Emily stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection looking back at her with a confidence she had never felt in herself. "I'm tired of being afraid," she said softly. "I want to be strong. I want us to be a family again." Eleanor watched them, faint smile playing on her lips. "You have the power to break the curse," she said. "The mirror's hold on you is only as strong as the fears you carry. Let them go, and the mirror will shatter." With that, the Harcourts took a collective breath. Their hands joined as they faced their reflection. They closed their eyes, each of them silently confronting fears and regrets that had kept them bound to this dark reality. James let go of his guilt, forgiving himself for the distance he had allowed to grow between him and his family. Clara released her obsession with control, accepting that she couldn't protect them from. Emily faced her fear of helplessness, realizing that she was stronger than she had ever believed. As they embraced these truths, the mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Cracks appeared, spreading outwards from the center, the sound of shattering glass filling the room. The light in the room intensified, blinding them for a moment, and when they opened their eyes, they were back in the real world, standing in the hallway of the mansion. The mirror was gone, replaced by a few scattered shards of glass on the floor. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight that had hung over the house lifted. The mansion, once a place of fear and darkness, now seemed almost welcoming, as if it too had been freed from the curse. Eleanor's spirit, now fully at peace, appeared before them one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "You have freed us all." With those final words, she faded away, leaving the Harcourts alone in the quiet hallway. They stood together, shaken but alive, the reality of what they had just experienced slowly sinking in. "We did it," Clara murmured, still holding on to James and Emily. "We really did it." But as they began to gather themselves, preparing to leave the mansion for good, Emily felt something small and sharp in her pocket. She reached in and pulled out a tiny shard of glass, the last remnant of the mirror. For a moment, she saw a fleeting image reflected in the glass, a dark figure watching her from the shadows of the alternate reality. She gasped, dropping the shard to the floor, where it shattered into dust. The image lingered in her mind, a shadowy presence that seemed to whisper to her from beyond the veil. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the unease remained. As they walked out of the mansion, leaving it behind forever, Emily couldn't help but glance back one last time. The house was silent, still, but in her mind's eye she could still see the dark reflection, waiting, watching. Had the curse truly been broken, or had they merely escaped its grasp, leaving it to wait for the next unsuspecting soul? The question lingered, unanswered, as they stepped out into the light, the mansion's shadow stretching long behind them.